Could the pandemic threaten the survival of Africa's wildlife? Game reserves that rely on tourism are running out of money and the poachers are circling. Will decades of conservation efforts be lost? This is Inside Story. Hello there, welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. Africa's wildlife is one of the continent's biggest attractions. Game reserves and national parks, they welcome millions of visitors every year who want to experience wild animals close up. They rely on that revenue to pay for conservation projects. But now revenue flow has stopped entirely because of COVID-19 travel restrictions. And many rangers who protect the animals from poachers, they've lost their incomes. Conservationists are now worried that the economic toll could push more people into the illegal wildlife trade. We'll discuss this with our guests in just a moment. But first, this report from Malcolm Webb in Nairobi.
These lions don't know it, but the coronavirus is a danger to them too. While they probably can't get the virus, the pandemic does, indirectly, threaten their habitat. They live in a nature reserve where Nicholas Koyeo normally guides tourists who come to see endangered animals. It's near Kenya's capital, Nairobi. The government suspended international flights nearly 2 months ago. No foreign tourists have come here since.
It's actually a bit worrying because if we don't actually receive clients in the country, then I'm afraid that lots of jobs are actually going to be lost.
Visitors normally eat and sleep in the camp where Nicholas worked. It's had to temporarily close. Normally, in camps like this, all the beds are fully booked during the peak seasons. More than 2 million foreign tourists visited Kenya last year. Most of them come here to see the wildlife that lives in the reserves. And the money they spend creates millions of jobs and provides crucial funding for conservation. The fees charged for visiting reserves and camps pay for the salaries of rangers who protect animals from poachers. The communities living nearby depend on the incomes of those employed in the sector, and if livelihoods are lost, people are forced to find other ways to survive.
Things like poaching, either for household protein supplement, or cutting down of trees to supplement household income, and that is tied to the harsh economic realities occasioned by COVID-19.
The Nairobi Reserve is unique in that it sits just on the edge of the city. Conservationists say, in the long run, if tourism isn't economically viable, reserve land will be used for farming or property development instead. Just outside the park is a sanctuary for orphaned animals. These walkways are usually teeming with visiting schoolchildren. The warden told us educating local community is key to conserving wildlife and its environment.
Most of our domestic tourists come from up country. These are mainly the schools, and they are no longer coming because the schools were closed. Due to the current status, the revenue again has gone down.
Nobody here expects things to change before the coronavirus restrictions are lifted. Conservationists say they're looking for other ways to fund the reserves, so the wildlife within them and the people around them can have a future. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Nairobi, Kenya.
So it's pretty clear that wildlife tourism is very important to countries in Africa. In fact, the $39 billion industry is the main source of funding for conservation on the continent. For example, tourism accounted for 85% of South Africa's funding for wildlife services and national parks in 2018. But the global travel sector is projected to shrink by up to 30% this year due to the pandemic. And an estimated 24 million tourism jobs could be lost across Africa. Well, it's an important story. Let's bring in our panel. And Maasai Mara standing by is Daniel Sopia. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Maasai Mara Wildlife Conservancies Association. And then in Amboseli in southern Kenya, Craig Millar, Head of Security of Big Life Foundation. He heads up anti-poaching operations. He manages 300 rangers across East Africa and also appears in the Ivory Game on Netflix. You might have seen him there. And also in Nairobi, Kadu Sibanya, who's the CEO of the African Wildlife Foundation. A warm welcome to you all. And in fact, Kadu, if I could start with you, As we've just heard, tourism is a huge employer and a fundamental enabler of conservation in Africa. And now that income stream is just dead in the water. So what's been the result of that?
No, we've seen this devastating blow. You can imagine, Nick, wildlife tourism funds, like you said, in South Africa, 80%. In some other countries, in Uganda, it's almost 100%. In conservancies, where wildlife lives outside protected areas, it's 100% funded through tourism. It's a blow in a number of ways. One, that income supports the patrol and the entire management of these areas. Two, salaries from salaries to rangers for fueling cars, for maintaining food patrols, food ratios, and some other community aspects, incomes, household incomes. The other aspect to it, Nick, is that the presence of tourism, tourists in these areas increases the human eye that deters poachers from entering these parks. But also it reduces human-wildlife conflict. So it's not all about revenue, it's an increased human presence in the parks. It also helps in keeping wildlife inside the parks because of the presence of patrols and the guides. And then it supports the rural economies that majority of communities depend on.
Right, okay, so on that, let's bring in Daniel Sopia. And Daniel, I should just say that the number of COVID-19 cases in Kenya is relatively low comparatively, but the impact, as we've been hearing, is very high. So as Kadu just alluded to there, communities are key to protecting Kenya's ecosystems and indeed ecosystems across Africa. What impact has this sudden evaporation of tourism had on those communities that you're dealing with?
Yeah, thanks. So here at the Maasai Mara Wildlife Conservancies Association, we have a membership of 15 conservancies, which is owned by over 14,000 individual landowners or land titles holders. These 15 conservancies rely heavily on tourism. It is buffering the Maasai Mara National Reserve from east to west. And they actually depend on 100% of tourism to survive, and also some other bilateral and private funding that also support some of their operations. So with the immediate closure of the international border, the funding situations in the Mara has dried up. The communities that have been relying on tourism has hugely been affected. Closure of livestock market has been another additional stress that the landowners cannot be able to sell livestock.
Right, so what does that practically mean for people who suddenly can't earn a living or put food on their table?
It's quite difficult here in the Mara at the moment. I think the landowners majorly are now surviving on their livestock. Basically, it's a rainy season in the Mara right now, so they survive on the milk. That is the major food right now that the landowners are actually relying on in the Mara. A number of them are still able to receive some little flowing income, basically through the employment for those who are employed in camps. Those who are also receiving a lease fee, it hasn't yet dried up completely. They are still receiving a 50% lease payment as of now. So, I mean, as it continues, it might get worse, but as of now, at least they're still able to put food on their table.
Right, at the moment it's not too bad, but the pressure's building. Craig Millar, you spend much of your time out in the field running security for, what is it, 1.5 million acres of wilderness. Tell us a little bit, very briefly, about your work there, first of all, for the Big Life Foundation, and then tell us what you're seeing as a result of COVID-19 and what you think the risks and threats are.
So Big Life, our main role essentially is providing anti-poaching and wildlife security in the areas outside of protected areas in southeast Kenya and northeast Tanzania. We do this mainly through community rangers who are from the area, employ them and leave them still plugged into their community, so we get an information flow. So that's the main part of it. Obviously, there's lots of other little things that will take too long to get into here. But essentially, we're looking at trying to get ways to make wildlife valuable to people. So that speaks directly to the situation we're in at the moment, where essentially the value of wildlife without tourism has decreased a huge amount, and we need to find other ways to bring that back up to an amount that makes it worth putting up, tolerating a lot of conflict with them. So at the moment, what we're seeing is obviously quite a big influx. Probably about a month ago, when the lockdown was starting, a lot of people from Nairobi and other towns were turning back home. So the population within our areas, the human population's increased. And on top of that, obviously, the employment rates jumped up. So far, we've actually obviously been trying to keep a really close eye on poaching numbers and seeing what's happening across our area as well as outlying areas to try and predict where we might get hit. We can't say quite yet that there's been a spike within our area, although we did have our first three poaching incidents for the last kind of 3 months happen in the last week. I suspect they are probably related to the fact that there's a lot of people who are hungry at the moment, but it's too soon to say.
Right. What are your fears about where this could lead?
Well, we've seen it elsewhere. In areas outside of our operating, we've seen poaching go up quite significantly. So that's a major worry. All the success we've had over the last kind of 5-6 years, getting it right under control, we really can't afford to go backwards on that. So we've got to try and maintain it as we are. But, you know, and aside from the operations side, exactly what the other two have talked about in the effect on the economy over the longer term is what's really worrying. And that's what will feed into poaching becoming more of a significant threat to our area and across the whole area. At the moment, we're worried about the bushmeat poaching, but if it carries on for a long time, then you have to start worrying about the trophy poaching. So looking at elephant and rhino as well, where obviously the risk is a lot higher, but the upside for anyone who's in a desperate situation is also a lot higher.
Craig, just very quickly, for those who perhaps don't know the difference, what is the difference between the bushmeat poaching and the trophy poaching?
So bushmeat poaching is poaching for meat. There's two different levels within that. There's subsistence, food for your own table, and commercial, where you're looking to sell that meat. Subsistence is always a threat, but not necessarily anywhere near as much as either of trophy poaching or commercial poaching. So commercial bushmeat poaching is what we're really worried about at the moment. And trophy poaching is looking for animal parts to then sell, not for ingestion. So you're looking at elephant ivory, rhino horn, cat skins, claws, bones, anything and anything that someone would sell and look to get more than what the meat's worth. So that obviously has been what's decimated a lot of wildlife populations in Africa over the last 50 years. It's what we have got under control in this area and most of Kenya, through obviously not us solely, but a lot of other partners involved. But what's going to happen next is
thanks for that. We're going to move it on. Daniel, just on this issue of bushmeat poaching, first of all, as pressure begins to tell and you know, the search for food for the table becomes next to impossible, so the only alternative is to go out into the bush and get it and kill it. How would you deal with that with your communities? How can you encourage them not to do that, and what needs to be done to help them not to do that?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. Naturally, that the Maasai people, they don't eat wild animals. It's a taboo to eat a wild animal. That's why we have the livestock. That is why we still have wildlife concentrated within Maasai-rich zone. So that is really one fortunate thing that we have. Most of the poaching that happens within the conservancies and the periphery of the protected areas in the Mara is a result of people who really do this on commercial basis. So they come from Nairobi or other places in the country trying to sneak into the conservancies or to the National Reserve to do poaching. So thanks to the effort of the community, and generally even before the COVID situation starts, the Mara has always been very lucky that we get very less of the poaching cases starting from 2013 to date. So that is really one thing that we are really proud of, that the community do not rely heavily on bushmeat as an alternative for subsistence. So we still have the rangers in place in the conservancies and doing a very good work coordinating with the county government rangers who are also manning the National Reserve. So without joint effort and continual support from our organization, that is the Maasai Mara Conservancies Association, we're working to provide support to make sure that minimum conservancies operations will continue throughout the next 12 months, which is the time we expect this will last.
Right, and Kadu, what do you think is at stake here? And there's a report by United for Wildlife which says that the main threat is in protected areas and reserves which have been forced to reduce ranger force levels, not something that Daniel's talking about, but areas that have been forced to reduce the ranger levels. So what needs to be done, what's at stake, and what needs to be done to help those areas?
I think what is at stake is really, conservation, we need to look at it as a land use exercise. It's an alternative land use in terms of the economies Africa is looking at. So really what is at stake is how do we sustain wildlife if we cannot sustain the wildlife economies that is needed to support and sustain wildlife and its habitats. You talked about these community areas. Actually, bushmeat, it's right. Bushmeat domestically consumed is not a major threat. It's where it becomes a business that people are now trading it and sending it to faraway places. Africans have lived with wildlife for a number of years. What is at stake is the consumption rate itself, especially in Central Africa, where we are worried about future zoonotic diseases, again, through bushmeat consumption. As we know, you said World Health Organization, 60% of the diseases found in humans are responsible from wildlife. And actually now 75% of the emergency infection diseases are from wildlands and wildlife. So how do we contain that? So as human species, we are also, our health is at stake as humans continue interacting with wildlife without proper management. The other thing that's at stake is Daniel, I think, talked about the economies. Our economies are at stake in order for us to sustain our livelihoods. A majority of Africans are in rural areas. We need to look at this as we develop the new economies for rural development. If we cannot move money, cash, into the hands of rural people, they are going to start trading and generating revenue from the resources they have, and that is wildlife. So we can't blame them for that, but we need to move very, very quickly and develop the economies that are necessary for people to survive alongside wildlife.
Okay, Kadu, I'm just going to jump in there because I'm so sorry. We've got so much to discuss, but not that much time. So I'm sorry about that. I'm just going to jump in there. So I want to take it on. So hang on there, because right now, as we've been discussing, is a tough time for many game reserves, but some see this as an opportunity.
My goodness, my dear, it's been so long since I have had the pleasure of being in your company.
Yeah, this South African company broadcasts safaris live on the internet, and people can see wildcats and other animals up close without leaving their homes. Its founder says viewership has increased fivefold, as you might expect, since early March. Craig, just to play devil's advocate here, perhaps that's the way forward. Perhaps a whole arena needs to be reshaped to find a way to keep the pressure off wildlife reserves and, to find a different way of taking this industry on.
Without question, things need to be reshaped. I'm not qualified to say in what shape or form. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the issue with the virtual tours is how do you produce that? How do you make that into funding? Right. So there's obviously that leap to be made. But yeah, I do see an opportunity in some ways, and that's not just limited to Africa. Obviously, there's a whole global impact of this, and how we can see the difference it's made to the environment, even in first world countries. So there's opportunities everywhere. As we've already said in this, is we need to move really quickly, and that's quite difficult to do when everyone's stuck at home.
Of course.
Trying to get things done. So there's certainly things that need to change. On the tourism aspect, it does bring about the question. In the past has always been conservation NGOs saying we need to make it sustainable. We need to integrate it into the economy. conservation needs to be sustainable in that it relies on tourism funds, and tourism needs to be increased. This has kind of put us back a long way on what was one of the real core parts of what's been changing over certainly Kenya and a lot of Africa over the past 5 years. So there are opportunities there. There's people who need I'm definitely not the right person to say where they are.
But Craig, as you go out on the ranges every day and out into the wilderness, what's the sense in your heart, if you like? How worried are you about this as you go out there? Do you feel a sense of despair about what's happening and what could happen?
Not yet, but yeah, when you're looking in the future, it's pretty scary. Doesn't really matter how many ranges you have, what the resources are, what intelligence you have, aircraft, anything. If you're, as soon as that critical number of people are desperate, you're wasting your time. And you have to remember, you're not looking to stop. You're just trying to keep it under control. You're not looking to save one or two animals. You're trying to keep an entire ecosystem or an entire population of wildlife. So you can, as soon as you've got 1,000 people who are hungry and they're all relying on bushmeat, there's nothing really you can do. You can arrest 50 a night, and that's still not going to make a dent in what's happening to the area, the conservation, the ecology, and the whole ecosystem. So if things carry on going as they are, and the economy just keeps getting worse and worse, and the outlook more and more dire, then things are going to get really difficult.
Right.
This kind of taking us back 5 years to where there wasn't a wildlife economy in certain areas.
Kadu, I think you want to jump in there. And I just wanted to say, we've been seeing some images here of mountain gorillas, because it's not just the big five we're talking about, it's also mountain gorillas. And this comes back to your point about zoonotic diseases. Even they are under threat from COVID.
Yes, Nick, I want to jump in. I think the biggest opportunity here is with African governments and our economic leaders, is really to reshape a new economy that responds to the resources we have in many of our countries in Africa. We cannot continue really relying on donations for wildlife, or in that case, international rivals. The opportunities that exist now that we can reshape the industry so that it includes domestic arrivals, it includes community ownership in the business itself, especially those near the parks. There are opportunities for us to develop infrastructures that respond to the needs of domestic arrivals, the value chain businesses that involve middle people within the localities, opportunities for environmental education. And as conservationists, it's also a huge opportunity. You talked about the numbers, 30 million people involved in the industry, for the governments to start seeing the value of conservation and the tourism industry. We had not been seeing that.
Craig, just to end on a lighter note, there must be some benefit to all of this, because the wildlife must quite like not having loads of tourists about, don't they? Have you seen any different changes in behaviour and so forth?
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot more where they normally aren't. Where they'd normally be avoiding just because it's too many cars driving, etc. They're much more relaxed. So we've had a buffalo on our front lawn, which hasn't happened in ages. The rhino that we look after in the Chulu Hills seem to be spreading out a bit more and spending more time in the open, which they haven't done in ages. So there's certainly positives on the wildlife side at the moment. On a personal point of view, I'm very much happy living in the bush, so this is forcing me to do something I want to do anyway. But there's obviously big negatives as well coming around the corner, and in the end of the day, it does come back down to economics.
Okay, well, we'll keep following this important story. Gentlemen, thanks very much indeed to all of you for your time. Thanks to our guests, Daniel Sopia, Craig Millar, and Kadu Sibanya. Thanks a lot. And thank you too for watching. And you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the entire team here in Doha, it's goodbye for now.